spirit of this lecture series is shown here, just to educate ourselves about this precious thing called water, especially in California. And what water, in general, whenever we talk about water, people talk about Chinatown or like this, and they only talk about the commodity value of water. But there is more to water than being merely a commodity. There is so much beauty in water, there is so much science in water, that we thought that it would be nice to have a colloquium which addresses water in a very broad way. And that's what this series is all about, to educate ourselves. Each semester we meet 4 times, the second Tuesday of each month, and we meet after 5 o'clock, so that all can have an opportunity to come, the student, the faculty, as well as the public. And the speakers are drawn from the humanities, natural sciences, engineering, and social science. So we don't have any particular theme. We just try to get distinguished speakers and let them speak, and sit back and enjoy their talk. I will have Professor Matt Condell introduce our speaker today, but today's talk is in the area of natural sciences. Next month we'll have Justice Ronald Roby will talk about the perspective of a judge, as how the judge looks at water problem. In November we have a civil engineer who is going to talk about failure of dams in California. We had quite a few failures in the past. And in December, we will have an environmental activist, Tom Graff, from the Environmental Defense. He is going to reflect on the role of non-governmental institutions on water and natural resources policy. And this colloquium is truly a campus-wide event. We have this colloquium is supported by the deans of engineering, environmental design, letters and science, natural resources, both House School of Law, and it's also supported by the Vice Chancellor and Provost, and we have some support also from the Metropolitan Water District of California. So before I ask Professor Condell to introduce the speaker, I'll pass this around. Please sign your name so that we know. Have some idea about the candidates. And also we have a few brochures here. You can please pick up, or I'll leave it here and pick up later on. And with that, it's my pleasure to request Professor Matt Condell from the School of College of Environmental Design to introduce our speaker today.
Thanks, Nari. I'm on the committee to invite these speakers, which is why I'm here. When Nari described the sorts of topics that he was looking for, not your usual topics, Phil came to mind immediately as the speaker. I should back up and say how I first met Phil Pister. It was 1985. I was an earnest graduate student at Johns Hopkins University, exiled to Oak Ridge National Lab. It was a very, very diplomatic way for my PhD advisor to tell me to get to work, because I've been organizing all these sort of anti-MX missiles and anti-space wars symposiums, things like that on campus, and I couldn't do that at Oak Ridge. So anyway, I was down there at a fellowship, but they made me earn my keep a little bit by working on some of their projects, and they had they did a lot of FERC environmental impact statements for hydroelectric. And so they put me to work on this project, studying the potential impacts of 7 hydroelectric projects that were proposed along the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada. This was after the passage of KERPA and the so-called hydro rush, where everybody was trying to put a small hydro plant on every stream. And so I came out and I heard about Phil long before I actually met him, because everyone involved in this process was, in fact, when I first heard about Phil, it was sort of like, well, be careful of him. You know, like, He was like a towering figure in society. And he had a lot of people scared. So.
Yeah, it's good.
And of course, once I met Phil, I well, immediately respected this guy as, okay, Phil was running the office of the Department of Fish and Game Bishop, which he'd been doing for about 30 years, right?
Yeah.
Something like that. And he went to Berkeley, studied wildlife with Stark Leopold, and some of you may know Phil's brother, Carl Pister, who was fearless engineering dean and chancellor at Santa Cruz. But Phil chose his career in the field, on the front lines. And not only was Phil very active and very effective in fighting things like the hydroelectric projects, which is where I got to know him, but he also had an experience, which he'll talk to you today, which made him become aware of desert fishes, native fish, which are not charismatic megafauna by most standard definitions. The public usually doesn't think about these ugly fish and these kind of remote backwaters. But Bill will talk about those today. He basically founded the Desert Fishes Council and has been extremely active and effective in raising awareness of these fish and protecting them, this unique gene pools that we have in these isolated areas. So I teach a short course out at the White Mountain Research Station most years, and I always have Phil come. And I used to bring a class out there, and again, their introduction the first night was always a lecture by Phil about the water history on the east side. It's a fascinating story, which you, I'm sure, will allude to tonight, but the focus today is on the desert fishing. Phil, thank you.
Thank you, Matt. I'll just move this out of the way. Yeah, I think I can probably talk better with the lights off. It'd be probably better for you anyway. So, is it going?
No, yes, it's on.
It's on? Okay, great. Oops. Okay. So we're going to talk about this. Reflections on reality, desirability, and conscience. And as I'm also going to make this, just by necessity, will be something of a personal narrative of the role that I've been playing for many years, and particularly the role of the University of California in me being here, Berkeley particularly. And so it's an interesting thing, but I have to always kind of bring these, I'm always a little bit leery when I come to a campus to give talks. This was on the front page of the student newspaper back at Brigham Young University some years ago. One of these huge university meetings they had. And as you can imagine, BYU being a religious school, they're very popular there. And when this came out, the representative of the president's office was my host there, was just totally mortified by this. And it's probably the high point of my career, really. I wrote a letter to the president of the university, and I said, really, the only thing that bothered me was the ambiguity of this. So I thought my reputation had been established long ago. I kind of resented this term suspected. So, so that's kind of the beginning. Hopefully the Daily Cal won't have something like this. Happily with the, well, okay. I guess it's almost trite to say it seems like only yesterday. But it really does. When I think about my own experience here, it seemed like just yesterday when I was an undergraduate. I was in awe of the university. I probably would not have come had it not been for the motivation of my brother, who was starting his graduate work after World War II, and my mother, who had gone to Cal before World War I. So there's only one place for me to go to school. And I was, like most very brilliant 17-year-olds, really not too sure what I wanted to do. And I would walk down every day. And I tried to take this same picture this morning from Piedmont down past the freshman chemistry lab back then. And so growing up with trees in the last 50 years, this was, when this happened was almost exactly 56 years ago right now, when I started in at Berkeley in 1946. And You can see how the campus has changed looking down that very famous kind of view that you get going down toward the Campanile. And I would take that walk, go down from Bowles Hall, where I was a resident for many years, and down to the Life Science Building. Made that trip literally thousands of times. And as I think back upon it, you can only make a judgment on these things in retrospect. But as I look back upon this, I wouldn't be here talking to you right now were it not for the superb orientation and education I received here at Berkeley. And back then, these are all photographs taken back in the late 40s and early 50s, showing the Colloquium lasts a long time to keep it cool. I would walk, having always had an interest in aquatic things. Anytime I would walk across, say, Strawberry Creek or along Strawberry Creek, in my mind I could see a trout or a golden trout, particularly under every rock that was out there. And that kind of gave me the motivation to slug it out in the first few years as you try to stay alive here at Cal. My major professor for between 6 and 7 years was Starker Leopold, Aldo Leopold's eldest son, who had just finished his own doctoral work here at Berkeley and was an assistant professor down at the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology in the old Life Science Building. And Starker laid really the foundation with his essential curriculum that he had laid out for my own future in this whole thing. And one of the things that it gave me a philosophy of education, and just for the heck of it, here, this was several years ago, I decided, okay, what's really important in education? So I went into our family library there, and I pulled off all my wife's books on the great books of the Western world, the St. John's University of Chicago concept. And then this would be the foundation layer. Then up here, the third layer up would be the pure science, would be the chemistry, botany, physics, ornithology, ichthyology, whatever. And in between that, what I would call the transitional literature. The writings of, say, Albert Einstein and Aldo Leopold, John Muir, and so on. That kind of pulled all of this together. And then, but I realized then that the research community, those that publish the day-to-day research efforts of universities, essentially rested upon the value and the integrity of those lower parts of the pyramid here. So that kind of got me going, and along with many of Aldo Leopold's statements in Sand County Almanac about essentially our responsibilities to future generations. Just as LeConte Hall was built by people that are no longer with us, similarly we lay groundwork and other people stand upon our shoulders in years to come. And I think this is particularly true with natural resources. So tonight, or this afternoon, we'll be talking about the integration of 4 words, key words here: ethics, being part of conservation being an integral part of biology, as is biodiversity. We'll talk about these 4 things because in later years, as I went into my career, I could see that most of our dilemma lay in the field of values and philosophy more by far than the technical aspects of resource management. This afternoon we'll be talking about essentially the desert areas of western North America, the Great Basin area here of the southwestern United States, then going into the northern parts, the northern states in Mexico, Chihuahua, Baja California, Sonora, whatever. And so we'll be talking about, of course there's a great difference in this photo mosaic, it's some 26 years old now, this is put out in the bicentennial. It's a photo mosaic of about 600 images all pulled together, and just to give kind of a portrait of the nation in the year 1976. But it really represents, just by the actual color of it here, you can see where the water is and where the water is not. Where I live in eastern California, we have an annual precipitation of about 100 millimeters per year, roughly 4 inches. Get a little bit farther to the east and to the south, you're in Death Valley, which is under 50 millimeters in many years. So it's an arid land for sure. The area where I worked for so many years out of Bishop it's a fantastic part of California, part of the United States, part of the world. Here at the tip of the pointer, this photograph was taken from a light aircraft, a Cessna, over the Funeral Mountains east of Death Valley within Death Valley National Park, but east of the main part of Death Valley. And here at the tip of the pointer is Mount Whitney at 14,496 feet in elevation. Then just 80 miles to the east of that, on the map, is Badwater below sea level at minus 282 feet. So here, this is my privilege really to work in an area that is this diverse, managing, which if defined would be trying to keep a handle on the biological integrity of about 1,000 waters, going from the crest of the Sierra Nevada on down into the Death Valley area, then on up the other side into southwestern Nevada. So this was a most interesting scenario to work in. Much of the habitat or the responsibility I had was in high mountain lakes. And here as we look from the upper part of the Convict Creek Basin, this would be here the Red Slate Mountain, a little over 13,000 feet, down the main spine of the Sierra Nevada. Here you see a lake in the lower left-hand quadrant here of the photograph. It's a lake where I did some of my graduate work, in fact a fair amount of it, right here in this lake and in the other lakes within the Convict Creek Basin. Here the water is very, very pure. Measured in terms of the limnologist in parts per million or milligrams per liter, a lake like this would probably be somewhere between 5 and 10 milligrams per liter. Through the years, throughout virtually every water in the Sierra Nevada, much to our regret now as we look at a broader picture, fish have been planted. A non-native predator. Virtually all of the high Sierra lakes were Pleistocene relics that were carved out by glacial action. And these creatures here, of course, let's back a ways here, were planted in there in an era where we weren't thinking about these things. Stephen Jay Gould made a very good observation once. He said, we're trapped in the ignorance of our own generation. And that is indeed true. We are indeed trapped in the ignorance of our own generation, and we are often learning from our mistakes. But we realize now that you just do not indiscriminately plant a vertebrate predator, particularly in lakes that are this fragile. And much of my work as a graduate student was to analyze the reasons for all of this. Then from those high lakes, boom, you're down on the floor of Death Valley, a place you don't think about fish. And you look around down there, and there are flowing streams and flowing bodies of water right in the floor of Death Valley. And you can imagine what Death Valley would be like as we talk here. The temperature would probably be somewhere hovering just above 100 degrees as it cools off in Death Valley. And you look around down there, and here, sure enough, in a pool, are little fish swimming around. These little guys. You notice the formation here of this precipitating minerals, this place called Cotton Ball Marsh. And these little fish here are living in water not with 10 milligrams per liter, but between 200,000 and 250,000 milligrams per liter, upwards of 25% salt, several times the salinity, of course, of seawater. But that's what evolution has allowed them to do. And the same way would be with the temperatures. You can imagine, again, what a water body in the floor of Death Valley is right now. I've often thought that a fish would be more at home in your Toyota battery than it would in a place like this. But yet that's what the evolution of creatures is all about, and they've learned to live there. And this is what these little guys look like. This is Cyprinodon salinus millerii, a subspecies of the Salt Creek pupfish. And the term millerii is named after Robert Rush Miller, who did, a professor at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, who did his doctoral dissertation on the fishes of the Death Valley hydrographic area. And we'll talk a little bit more about the extent of that as we get into the lecture. Okay, then comes the dilemma that we face. Lots of people. How do people view water? Probably not as we do. particularly people who, in the outdoors that like to go out and recreate with water. They think mainly, say the people of Los Angeles, that is what they think water should be. It'd be, say, a consumptive use in terms of going up there and going fishing. One of the things we do in Fish and Game, we like to find out where people are from. It's a very interesting part of the demographics of the whole thing. So you come up to, say, this guy right here and say, well, I see you're up here. Where are you from? We don't ask them counties, because most people that have recently moved into the Southern California area don't know what county they live in, but they do know what city they live in. Not without exception, but generally this is true. And they say, well, we're up here. This is the opening of the fishing season, the last Saturday of April. So we're here because we had to get away from it all. And you see the irony of that. But I guess to somebody who, say, drives the freeways of LA all the time, this is indeed getting away from it all. And they think of a body of water in terms of what this will produce, in terms of consumptive creatures that you would take, catch, rip the guts out of, throw in a freezer box and take to Los Angeles, and if there's any, if they've retained some degree of freshness, have them for dinner down there and brag about them to their friends. Now, I'm not saying this is a bad thing. But what it does is splits apart into a very obvious dichotomy people within agencies. There we say Fish and Game people, these are Fish and Game hands here, counting these fish, recording the data. There will be people who spend their entire career doing things like this. But this is fine. But on that last Saturday of April, there'll be another biologist here heading out through the desert, not giving a blast about how many rainbow trout are caught out of that reservoir, but wondering how the little desert fishes are coming out after a hard winter. And they'll be looking at these little guys. This would be another one of the little pupfishes. Pupfish, where'd they get that name, pupfish? This is an interesting point. They're named for their behavior by a very famous professor and UCSD, Carl Hubbs. And he named them this pupfish because of their playful behavior. You see a bunch of these little guys out in a pond somewhere, and they're chasing each other around, just like puppy dogs might do on a lawn. That's where they get the term pupfish. So what we have then between these two lines of thought for resources is a matter of values. How do you define values? Let's say there's 50 people here in this room, just a matter of speaking. If I were to hand out a piece of paper, say, define values, we'd probably get 50 rather similar answers, but they all be different. Let's assume there's a family living on the floodplain of the Mississippi River in a heavy rain year. The water's coming up fast. They realize that it's going to take their house before too long, so they back the family station wagon up and throw everything in it that they need to have to survive before they pull out of there and the flood takes their house. One item that they have is the old family Bible, with the recorded births and deaths in that family going back into the 1600s. All these entries written in the handwriting of the mothers and fathers of those generations. That's one item they can take. They can take one or the other. They can only take one of the two. The other item they can take is the video games that the kids have made and watch regularly because they're the fun things that kids really like. Well, the water's not rising all that fast, so they hold a little family console. Bring all the kids around and say, well, what are we going to take? We can take one box, we can't take them both. Which one? The younger kids say, we want to take our video game. We don't care about that old book. We worked hard, we mowed lawns, and we babysat to buy these tapes. That's what we want to take. Teenage son says, well, why don't we take both items down to the pawn shop that's still above water and see what we can get the most money for? But the family, or the father and mother say, no, we're going to take the old family Bible because that has values that can never be replaced. There's no way we could ever get that back. We know that in a relatively short time, you will see why we made this decision. Well, that metaphor can be applied very well to natural resources. There are those things that are transient in their value, those things that are enduring, as we talk about, say, people catching fish for breakfast or, say, trying to save an endangered species. Let's go out into Nevada, which is classic, well, anyway, the Great Basin. Great Basin, of course, going from the crest of the Sierra on the west on out to a mirror image reflection, say at Salt Lake City, here in the pluvial Lake Bonneville, on the extreme eastern extent. The area we're talking about here tonight, much of it will be right in here, which is the area around Death Valley. Back in the various pluvial periods during the Pleistocene, there were connectives all the way from the Owens Valley, which would be up in here, down through Searles Lake, China Lake, Panamint Lake, going in from the west. Coming in from the east would be the Amargosa River system, and then from the south, the Mojave River system, all ending up in Death Valley itself, which was at that time, at the high point, the high stand was essentially a lake about 600 feet deep and about 130 miles long, that is which is now basically dry. Well, then these big bodies of water, this would be Pyramid Lake here out of Reno, pluvial Lake Lahontan. The classic example, of course, is the Great Salt Lake that covered much of western Utah, northwestern Utah. So this then, as this began to dry up, as we went into the Holocene from the latter part of the Pleistocene, the fishes began to be distributed in different locations that remained wet. You fly over, say, this is a place called Ash Meadows, which is just east of Death Valley National Park. You look down here and you see this is one of the remnant springs. You get down on the ground and you begin to think about some of the concepts that have been brought about in past years. This is Charles Darwin. Darwin, of course, came up with his initial observations in the Galapagos Islands and off the coast of Ecuador, and based some of his original thinking upon the different beak morphologies of finch populations that were geographically isolated one from another in the Galapagos. And here we have, instead of islands of land in the ocean, here we have islands of water in a sea of sand. Yet the same evolutionary principles are there very clearly. And here in certain of these desert habitats, not quite, but almost, you can throw a rock from one subspecies into another subspecies habitat. That shows how rapidly these species have differentiated through the years. And here they are swimming around there, just having a lot of fun evolving. One of the most interesting things that I have had in my career revolved around this little island of water in a sea of sand, a place called Devil's Hole. Devil's Hole is part of a disjunct portion of Death Valley National Park, about a 40-acre area right in here, surrounding this black speck. What is that black speck? Let's get down on the ground and look at it. I received a phone call late in the 60s, so I think about 1967, from a biologist in Death Valley National Park. And he said, "Phil, you better get down here. Some stuff going on that bodes ill. And it's going to affect California sooner or later, because these are huge aquifers of actually fossil water underlying much of that part of the desert." And what was happening, one of the first habitats that isolated fish was about 45,000 years ago in Devil's Hole. So these fish have evolved more than the others. They've lost their pelvic fins through the evolutionary process. And you could almost watch this species going extinct before your very eyes as the water very gradually went down, down, down. This was in the late 60s. There was no real Endangered Species Act back then. So about half a dozen of us, me representing California, counterparts from Nevada, the big federal agencies, BLM, National Park Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, all had people who were deeply concerned about, what do you do? What do you do when you don't have a means of solving these problems? Well, one of Leopold's great statements has always motivated me that probably the best thing you can do is think 90 degrees from the norm. So while my colleagues were doing their best to make fishing better, which again is not a bad thing, I could see that if I spent my time making fishing better with the species going extinct before my very eyes, I really wasn't doing what I should be doing. So what we did, we brought in the fish here, they have to have water covering this shelf. It's a limestone shelf. This is limestone cavern, actually, Devil's Hole. If they don't have water covering the shelf, there's no place for the fish to spawn, and there's no place to produce food for them to eat. They eat algae primarily. And so what we did, we brought in 110 volts here, and to put in, you can see the tubes here reflected 90% daylight bulbs. So as that water went down, there would still be light to produce algae for the fish to eat. Here we tried to build an artificial shelf out of fiberglass roofing panels suspended from styrofoam, so that if this did go dry here, that at least the fish would have a fighting chance to stay alive as a gene resource and as a species. This item here is the U.S. Geological Survey spring level gauge with a drum recorder in it, this thing, to just keep us informed about, it was kind of like, you know, somebody shutting off the oxygen in this room. You know, you aren't going to live all that much longer. You might live for a while. This helped us to understand what these fish were putting up with. So what do? Happily, there was a way out. But before we get to that point, this, of course, as the word got out that some of those, quote, environmentalists were out there trying to stop this big agricultural operation that was lowering the water, a big company out of Vicksburg, Mississippi, Cappert Industries. And they were trying to get a hold of the water rights out there by putting a very spurious farming operation. And all around Devil's Hole, they were sinking these great, you think you're over in the Central Valley, big 12 and 16-inch casing pumps. And it was literally just pulling that water out from that big aquifer. There's a very low recharge rate, and the water was going down, down, down. Well, there were people employed by that outfit. So you had the good guys with these bumper stickers, and on the other side of the fence you had these guys. And they were equally devoted toward their cause. So all right, you can't win out of that area. You can't really win too many battles in a bar. So we went to the Interior Department in Washington. And happily, one of my former colleagues from California Fish and Game was Assistant Secretary of Interior then. He came down from Alaska with Walter Hickel. Assistant Secretary over Fish and Wildlife and Parks. So I phoned him up, a guy from Bishop, of all the weird coincidences. And I said, Chuck, Chuck Meacham is his name, we've got a real problem out there. The spring areas are going dry all over the desert. And of course, Devil's Hole is just one example. Same thing just north of Bishop out at Fish Slough. And so what can we do about this? Well, this guy appointed a top-level Washington group of all of the different agencies, including the National Park, or including the U.S. Geological Survey, who was saying, yeah, if they keep those pumps going, it's going to dry up every spring in that part of Nevada. But probably the key person on that task force was a representative of the Interior Solicitor's Office who could look and probe the legal aspects of this whole operation. So we were able then to get this into the courts. It wasn't easy, but we were able to do it. The first hearing was in July of 1972. This ultimately ended up in the U.S. Supreme Court. And this was an interesting thing. When I was being questioned as a witness on this whole thing by our attorney, we found out that the judge that was hearing this case, Roger Foley there from Las Vegas in the federal courthouse there, was a very, very religious person, very devoted Catholic. He never missed Mass. So by pre-design, I was asked as a witness what I felt the major issue was. I said, well, in responding to our attorney, I said, to me, this is simply, it's a matter of morality. It's like you might judge morality in the book of Genesis, of man's dominion over the earth. And you can imagine at that point, the defense lawyer just came flying out of his chair. Your Honor, I object. There's nothing here that relates to that at all. And the old judge, this let us know that we didn't have any enemies with him. He turned around with half glasses on. Mr. Lionel, be seated. Objection overruled. That's probably the most relevant thing we're going to hear during these proceedings. So this was a real interesting experience. Well, okay, then it went on. We were granted a preliminary injunction. Went on to the Ninth Circuit Court on appeal by the defendant. We were up against the state of Nevada and the land developer both. They were in cahoots in this whole thing. Then, upon petitioning from senators of 16 western states, because of the implications of water law, of who owns the water out in a place like that, it went to the U.S. Supreme Court. This was in January of 1976. And whereas the court normally takes maybe 20 to 30 minutes to hear each of the things that comes before them, they took most of an afternoon to hear the Devil's Hole testimony. Well, it takes them about 6 months for this whole thing to come together. And in June of 1976, the phone rang in the outer office, and the secretary said, well, it's Dr. Deacon from University of Nevada, Las Vegas wants to talk to you. It's one of these, I'm sure you've all been through this, where you're expecting some news and you know the news can be bad, so you almost don't want to hear it for fear it will be bad. I guess that's part of the problem you have of being gutless, but that was my feeling there. So I said, okay, answer the phone. Hi, Jim, this is Phil in Bishop. He says, guess what, Phil, we won. I said, Jim, I'll get right back to him. I'm in the middle of something right now. I'll phone you right back. I hung up the phone, closed my office door, and I broke into tears for, I'd guess, maybe 5 minutes. I didn't realize what a huge load this had been on all of us to see whether that fish could survive. So we were given some time, and this is Nevada State Journal from I think June 7th of 1976, beleaguered pupfish saved by Supreme Court. But this was not argued so much on the endangered fish as it was under who owns water under federal land. And the decision of the courts was that the federal government owns the water under federal land, and this of course was strongly antagonistic to the normal concept of water, who owns water. The states like to think they do. And we were quite grateful here in this Supreme Court decision of Capert versus the United States to have that reaffirmed for us. And over the Supreme Court building in Washington is chiseled out of the marble up here, of the granite, equal justice under law. And I think we all took some comfort in the fact that equal justice could be applied to some 19-millimeter fish as well as to human beings. This was part of, when Devil's Hole was set aside as part of Death Valley National Park in 1952, Professor Carl Hubbs again was instrumental in having President Truman set this aside for us. So that was an interesting, people often ask us when I put this slide here, what's the situation out there now? Well, okay, after the Supreme Court decision, the land was purchased by the Nature Conservancy, which then deeded it back after they bought it, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and now it's administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as the Ash Meadows National Wildlife Refuge. Protecting the first national wildlife refuge for this purpose of protecting the native plants, animals, invertebrates, there are all of them out there. It's the area of the, I think it's next to the Cuatro Ciénegas of northern Coahuila in Mexico. This has the highest degree of biological endemism of anywhere in North America. It's a marvelous place. So now it's pretty well protected in the short term, but we talk about now of development throughout the Southwest, the expansion of Las Vegas, Los Angeles, Albuquerque, Phoenix. All of these things impacting, of course, creatures like desert fish. From my own, although I was deeply involved in the Devil's Hole operations right north of Bishop, a place called Fish Slough. At one time, the entire world population was in this pool here of the Owens pupfish, dependent on radiosis. And this pond here began to dry up. This fellow here is a graduate student at UCLA working for me at that time. And he came into the office and said, Phil, that pond's drying up, and if it dries up, we're going to lose the fish. Well, what he didn't say, that was the only population of those fish anywhere on the planet. So we went out, we dropped everything. I went tearing out there with my 2 guys with buckets and battery-powered aerators and worked late into the evening. At one time, I held the entire world population of the Owens pupfish in 2 buckets, one in either hand, gradually making my way back across the desert full of gopher holes and barbed wire, hoping to heaven I wouldn't trip, because if I had, that species would be extinct now. We built a refuge out there, and when we got the refuge going, Dr. McCullough from over at Integrative Biology just do the restocking there. This is, all of these things when he's doing his doctoral work on the Tule out there in the Owens Valley. And that's the little guy that we say, okay, so this brings us to a point now, I think it's a valuable thing to discuss. Those endangered species, what good are they? We've gone clear to the Supreme Court. So my stock answer that I've developed through the years, when people ask me about what good are they, I'll just turn right to them and say, what good are you? And it kind of puts things in a good perspective. It really does. It seems like kind of a crass, kind of a wise answer, but it's not. And you can go on to say that if it weren't for 6 billion Homo sapiens, these little creatures wouldn't have the problems they do right now. And usually it gets them thinking. If nothing else, when your next door neighbor or some guy at the gas station asks you what good an endangered fish is, well, you can come back with an answer like that. And unless the person's totally turned off, you can maybe make some points with that. Well, okay, how did this ethic then develop here in the United States? Much of it came from Yale University back at the turn of the 18th into the 19th centuries, or the 19th and the 20th centuries. Back in the late 1800s into the early parts of our last century, Yale, their School of Forestry and Environmental Studies on Prospect Street there in New Haven, they have quite a thing that it was started up pretty much by Gifford Pinchot. Pinchot came up with what we call the resource conservation ethic of the greatest good for the greatest number over the longest period of time. That was in 1889 when Pinchot came out of there. He learned his forestry in Europe, and he was selected then by President Theodore Roosevelt to start up the U.S. Forest Service. And 20 years later, out of money provided by the Pinchot family, Pinchot, the family was quite wealthy. He became governor of Pennsylvania, and they were happy to set up the forestry school. Came Aldo Leopold. And Leopold, of course, kind of turned that whole thing of the greatest good for the greatest number into the question, what is the greatest good for the greatest number over the longest period of time? He was the first ecologist, really, that we recognize as such. But I can't really talk about heroes or heroines in this business without bringing out one of probably the person that had the most to do with where we are now in the environment, Rachel Carson, with her work back in the late 50s and then into the early 60s, and her tremendously powerful book, Silent Spring, because this got people to really thinking and brought us into the kind of the environmental movement that we see reflected here in this room. But Leopold's Sand County Almanac, this has always been a very important book to me because there were no texts available in my field that really addressed this type of thing. This is largely a philosophical book, but it's just loaded with wisdom. I remember Starker coming in, this is his eldest son, coming into class one day with a sheaf of mimeograph material. And that's before copy machines. This would be about late 40s, 1949, the spring, April. And he laid down this stack of mimeograph material. He said, this is a graduate class or an upper division class in wildlife management. You folks might like to read this. It's some of the things that Dad has written. And of course, Aldo died in 1948, so this is a year after Aldo Leopold passed away. So this book then became essentially my guide for my career over in the East Side, trying to address some of these issues we're talking about here this afternoon. Leopold defined his land ethic. In short, a land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen of it. It implies respect for his fellow members and also the respect for the community as such. So this was the first time then that human beings were put into the ecosystem instead of thinking they were sitting off to the side observing things. No, this let them know, and furthermore, respect for the community as such. That means everything out there. So this, for me, then provided the motivation that I needed to go ahead with things like preserving desert fishes. Leopold, in a later publication, this is done by his son Luna, professor here at Berkeley, emeritus now, One of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. Much of the damage inflicted on land is quite visible to laymen. An ecologist must either harden his shell and make believe the consequences of science are none of his business, or he must be the doctor who sees the mark of death in a community that believes itself well and does not want to be told otherwise. So that kind of puts us, people with an ecological education, as it kind of puts the burden on us. Those of us who do see these marks of death in a community, you can define this by the desert fishes, desert system, not just the fishes, but all of the components that make it possible for fish to exist, and us too. This is a good statement here. It's just overwhelmingly true that one of the penalties of an ecological education is one lives in a world of wounds. We will see these things, but you have a terrible time getting this through to the average citizen, and extremely difficult getting it through to politicians, because most of these things are not popular politically. What happened here in the good old US? Well, probably what happened to us, we went almost overnight to the era of the stagecoach to the jet airliner. Our technological advances greatly outstripped our philosophical ability to keep up with them. And it began to twist our values then. This is what David Ehrenfeld back at Rutgers calls the arrogance of humanism, the assumption that no matter what kind of a mess we create, there's some way we can work our way out of it. And indeed, if there's a bright spot in something like global warming or ozone problems, it's that people are realizing those same ultraviolet rays fall on us just like they're falling on everything else. So this indeed is an arrogance, there's no question about that. What we've done, this is Millet's portrayal of the Angelus, the old French peasant couple, at the beginning of the day as the church bells toll in their village, bowing their heads and giving thanks to the land because it gives them all that they have. And the irony of it is, we are just as dependent upon that land now as the peasant couple. We're just farther from it. Leopold in Sand County says, one of the problems we face nowadays is people think that heat comes from the furnace and breakfast comes from the supermarket. You know, it's just that we're farther from it. That makes it harder for us to believe. When the crops fail here, these people have an immediate problem. It's not quite that immediate with us. So this, I think, very eloquently kind of talks about, in a bit of good artwork here, just what we face today. We've taught our children, this is a philosopher back at BYU, we've taught our children by precept and example that every living thing exists to be converted into cash, that whatever would not yield a return should be quickly exterminated to make way for creatures that do. Early on in my career, this is one of the big things with California Fish and Game. If they're in the huge push to make sport fishing better, we killed off things that now we're doing our best to try to bring back. And that shows how we're trapped in the ignorance of our own generation, as Stephen Jay Gould reminded us so well. Maybe what we need to do is look at ourselves in the bigger picture. Now, we can walk down the trail from the upper part of Big Pine Creek, for instance, over on the east side. And there's a butterfly out there, and we can look at that butterfly. If we're careful, we can maybe miss it. We might even step on it. But if we're fortunate, we'll look back up the canyon where both we and the butterfly came from and look up toward the Palisade crest here. This is Mount Sill, North Palisade over in here, and the big peaks surrounding Upper Big Pine Creek. And we realize compared to those mountains, we're both pretty small, both us and the butterfly. And if we want to feel even smaller, we get and look at the planet Earth from across the moon, one of the Apollo shots. And we have a tough time seeing California, let alone the Sierra Nevada, or even North America for that matter. And I think that everyone owes it to himself or herself at least once or twice a year on a clear night to go out and lay on your back on the lawn somewhere out in a flat area and look up into the sky and just kind of speculate on how we fit into this whole picture. I think this is a healthy thing for us to do. It's an awesome thing to do if you just lay there and maybe think about it for a couple of hours, which I really strongly recommend that you do. One of the first people who began to integrate this kind of thinking together was Alfred Russel Wallace, one of Darwin's contemporaries in the British Museum back in the 1850s. Wallace did much of his work. He was both a botanist and an invertebrate zoologist off in the East Indies, off of Java, in the big islands there of that part of the Malaysian archipelago. And he got word that the British Parliament was, because of budget cuts, and this is nothing new, the ones we have today at the university, they were thinking of divesting the British Museum of the collections, the biological and botanical collections that the British do so marvelously well. Doing this because collections are not revenue producing, yet they're the basis of much of what we do in biological and botanical sciences, life sciences. So he was just infuriated by this, and he wrote a paper published in 1863 during the Civil War. If you can imagine this kind of thinking, let's say, what did Wallace say? The naturalist looks upon every species of animal and plant now living as the individual letters which go to make up one of the volumes of our Earth's history. As a few lost letters may make a sentence unintelligible, so the extinction of the numerous forms of life which the progress of cultivation invariably entails will necessarily render obscure this invaluable record of the past. It is, therefore, an important object to preserve them. And this could come out of this morning's Chronicle or Daily Cal. If this is not done, future ages will certainly look back upon us as a people so immersed in the pursuit of wealth as to be blind to higher considerations. They will charge us with having culpably allowed the destruction of some of those records of creation which we had in our power to preserve. And while professing to regard every living thing as a direct handiwork and best evidence of a creator, yet with a strange inconsistency, seeing many of them perish irrecoverably from the face of the earth, uncared for and unknown. A marvelous statement with the obvious political ramification. If you're dealing with Parliament, you better deal with the Church of England at the same time. But at any rate, it did the job, and they still have those collections. But it shows that through the years, human beings, otherwise rational human beings, have a propensity for doing dumb things. Happily, we were able to keep the British Museum collections. And I've often wondered, as we talk about values, you come up with some creature like the African lion, and it's no problem getting funds to preserve them. Not so hard now with the Endangered Species Act, but if you want to get laughed at, and I would say not only, but maybe even particularly, say in an agency such as my former agency, I'm retired now from California Fish and Game. If you want to work on something like a spotted toad, Bufo punctatus here, you get laughed at. And take it one step further, this thing is a giant compared to these little guys, hydrobiid snails on a dime, less than a millimeter across. And so this is a matter of how our values come into these things. It's kind of like walking down the Muir Trail. Roger, that's a picture that's certainly familiar to you. And you go past Garnet Lake and you look up to Ritter and Banner Peaks. Think, well, that's a pretty picture, all right, but really not as pretty as it could be. The peaks should be sharper, the snowbanks should be bigger, the lakes aren't the color I like them, and the tree's crooked. So when we talk about the relative value of organisms, it's the same thing as trying to criticize and recreate to our own liking a natural scene like this. Why is it that art collectors would probably spend hundreds of millions of dollars to acquire the Mona Lisa, the original, to place in their art gallery, and you have a tough time getting a couple of $100 to preserve something vastly more admirable, which is a natural species of some type? This is, I guess, one of our real weaknesses as human beings. Here's another, I think, something I want to at least point out to you here. We have gone through, say, in aquatic stuff, the era of people wanting to go fishing. I'm not going to go through all of these details. The point here is, in 1960, California sold more fishing licenses than they did in the year 2000, even though the population had gone up nearly 2.5 times in that period. So that shows people are doing different things now. Sport fishing is on its way downhill. And you can just pick this up just going out and say on the Muir Trail, walking up and down and seeing how many fishing rods you see. When it used to be everybody had one, now it's rare. Most of these people are up there for other reasons. So I just wanted to get you thinking about we're evolving from one social structure to another in this respect. We're going into things like biological diversity, Wilson's famous book here on biodiversity. Conservation biology, edited by Mike Salea, a former Santa Cruz professor. He's living in Colorado now, a good friend, really a good guy. And so this then, probably during the early part of the Clinton administration, when Bruce Babbitt became Secretary of Interior, this became one of the major thrusts to inventory what the wild creatures are of the state of California. And new ideas are difficult to catch hold in bureaucracy. There's nothing probably more inflexible than entrenched bureaucracy. It's not too different from the academic community. If you want to talk, say, a full professor into what he's doing for the last 30 years is wrong, you have a tough time doing that. But so we come up with these new ideas, have a tough time getting funding for it. And the next slide is one of Max Planck, the German physicist and philosopher, who put it this way: for those of you who may be frustrated by having an administration or maybe, say, even a graduate advisor that you have some real problems with, let's look at what Planck had. A new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that's familiar with it. And so just hang in there, dig in your heels. He or she will die someday, and then you can go on with the way things should be run. Environmental ethics is becoming a major part now. Most major universities now have curricula. They have courses in environmental ethics. Philosophy departments are beginning to incorporate these. It's harder in some of the big research universities. Philosophers don't like to deal with practical issues at all. But what this allows us to do, and we have people trained this way, instead of just producing trained people going to doing jobs, they become missiles without guidance systems. When you bring in these things, these missiles get a guidance system. You go down then to that lower raft of books that I showed earlier on, because that's where your guidance comes from in the big picture. Albert Schweitzer's book on reverence for life, his quotations are just beautiful in that book. So what we have here, we find ourselves then with these little fish swimming around out in the desert, and the little snails and the little spotted toads and everything else. We begin to look and say, well, okay, let's take this old watch. Let's look at this thing. What can we take out of that watch and have the watch still run? Well, we can't take this off because that's the stem that winds the old watch. And the springs in here that provides the power for the thing, and here's a balance wheel that makes it accurate. And you realize that probably you can't take anything out of there and make sure that the watch is going to run. And one of Leopold's great statements in the San County Almanac, one of the first principles of intelligent tinkering is to keep all the parts. And that's probably for the guy across the street that thinks you're nuts for working on desert fish. Say, well, who knows what value these have? And if for no other reason, we have a moral obligation as supposedly the superior creature on this planet. The marine mammals might question that. We certainly must be careful how we handle these irreplaceable resources. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recognizes, they have some very good people in their different technology centers. And here at Dexter, New Mexico, they have an old fish hatchery they've turned into an endangered species refuge where they have different populations of most of the desert fishes out there that are having real problems now. They hold them in these ponds so until we can work out the political problems. A good example here is the Colorado River and the huge problems that it faces. We have the big fishes of the Colorado, and they have rearing technologies now to try to keep these fish alive. But it shows what a sharp edge we're walking on right here. So I think all of a sudden we begin to see, at least from my perspective, the difference between the old family Bible and the videotapes. This I borrowed from a philosophy professor at the University of Georgia, a fellow named Brian Norton, who done some excellent writing on this type of thing. Okay, so you have all of these different things that you have to face. Matt Condolf at the introduction talked about the problems we face with the hydroelectric developments. How do you tell? What guidelines can you use of those things that are really valuable and those things that you can push aside? Well, Leopold says, as kind of a corollary to the land ethic I read earlier, that a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. So this is the test that I would always take. Say a hydroelectric project comes in, any project, say a subdivision, anything, that when these EIRs would come across my desk, I'd read them and see just how they fit into this. I felt as a biologist that they were going to be retain the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. Okay, I'd sign off them, but if not, I'd dig in my heels and fight to the bitter end to make sure that those projects were changed so that they would adhere to this. It's a simple thing, but yet it's a very easily applied thing. Of course, there's some subjectivity to this. A lot of people will say, yeah, what does agriculture, for instance, have to do with maintaining biological integrity? Well, there are exceptions. You have to feed people. But by and large, this is, I think, a defensible statement. So we come back to another very fine philosopher at Indiana University of Bloomington. He talks about the environmental crisis as an outward manifestation of a crisis of mind and spirit. There can be no greater misconception of its meaning than to believe it to be concerned only with endangered wildlife, human-made ugliness, and pollution. These are part of it. But more importantly, the crisis is concerned with the kind of creatures we are and what we must become in order to survive. So this becomes a personal thing then. It becomes, in our situation, a quest for excellence within each of us to make the necessary sacrifices. Now, it's a lot easier said than done. You talk about the guy across the street that just bought a new Ford Expedition and tell him what he's doing is wrong. It's a pretty tough thing to do sometimes. But yet, this, I think, brings it out. This is our own personal obligation to do these things. So what we have here is watching the integrity. This is our next slide. We changed the magazines. We have to realize that habitat integrity is basic to everything. Then you have the support organisms, the non-game and endangered species, depending upon this, the game and economically important species, resting upon the integrity of those layers below, then our own personal interests of human beings, all dependent upon the integrity of the habitat upon which they are based. Leopold says, again so accurately in San Antonio, we assume that game species support us, forgetting all about which support game species. A really good way to put it. Okay, just got a very handful of slides. Okay, away we go. So I read one time, this is before the Apollo shots, that once we see the planet, which we've done now, from outer space, it'll assume something of a different perspective to us. My wife gave me a book for Christmas a while back called The Home Planet. Pictures taken from outer space on these different Apollo shots and also by Soviet cosmonauts back in that era. Their impressions as they flew around the Earth. One of the most thoughtful ones I could pick out of that was by an East German, fellow named Sigmund Jahn, who probably being in the Eastern Bloc saw the tremendous damage to their ecosystems over there under the communist rule. So he wrote this in his notebook as he looked down on the planet. He said, before I flew, I was already aware of how small and vulnerable our planet is. But only when I saw it from space, in all its ineffable beauty and fragility, did I realize that humankind's most urgent task is to cherish and preserve it for future generations. So that, I think, becomes our overwhelming obligation here. Those of us who understand these things, is to do what we can to preserve these things for future generations. I'm hoping there will always be a place that a mother or father can take a son or daughter and have them go fishing. That's a good thing to do. There's no problem with that at all. But I hope when that young man catches his fish and cleans it, pulls the guts out of it, that he views that creature as something as more than something you just caught and eat. That it's a life form, just as he or she is a life form, that's deserving of a better bit of philosophy from us than we've given in the past. So here we come back again to the great cities of the American Southwest and northern Mexico. Well, I think El Paso, Juarez now is out of water, and they expect the population to double there in the next 10 years, something like that. This is Los Angeles, it could be Albuquerque, it could be Las Vegas, it could be Phoenix, Tempe. If you move eastward, it could be any of these huge cities, all of which exist on imported water. How much of that is there? When we as human beings begin to see the difference between wants and needs and have the political will and courage to pull out of this. We've got lots of people, and they're not going to get any fewer. This is a water park in Tokyo, I think. It's kind of an interesting Interesting picture. But it kind of illustrates the problem of huge numbers of people. Well, okay. In the Eastern Sierra, where I've lived for much of the last half century, it's a big peak on the western skyline, Mount Tom, one of the big peaks that kind of form a bowl where Bishop is. And I was out walking one morning, and I looked up, happily I had my camera along, at old Mount Tom, 13,580 feet high. At that time, the sun was rising, and the moon was setting behind the mountain. And to me, it kind of, being something of a philosopher in these things, my wife once mentioned that I'm the kind of guy to break into tears at the opening of a supermarket. I think it's quite that bad. But I can see that maybe there's some hope here for the future as we see the end of one era of thought and the beginning of new thinking here. That's where universities come into play. Other training and educational institutes. This is a National Conservation Training Center run by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service back in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. Marvelous new facility there, thanks to Robert Byrd, Senator. If you're going to spend money on pork, it's a great way to do it. But as you go into their commons area, much of that is based on a historical perspective on things. Here's this famous picture here of John Muir and Theodore Roosevelt standing on Glacier Point, Yosemite National Park. And we have all of the old agencies and the earlier National Park Service, the old Bureau of Fisheries, which is now the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Division of Forestry, which is now the U.S. Forest Service. And you can see how we've built upon the thinking and the courage and the abilities of those who've come before us. How do you do these things? This quotation from Ben Franklin has been above my desk for half a century now. And my rule, in which I've always found satisfaction, is never to turn aside in public affairs to views of private interest, but to go straight forward in doing what appears to me right at the time, leaving the consequences with Providence. It goes without saying that through the years, working on the type of thing, because what I did was break with the establishment back about 40 years ago, and began to work on things like desert fish. As I mentioned, holding the whole species in 2 buckets. It was interesting, at that same time, I had to stop a big trout fishing project, and we were supposed to do an evaluation of that. And I can't help but remember the words of one of the top people of the department, the director of the department. "What are you messing around with little fish for?" He says, "Maybe someday you'll get your priorities straight." Well, it comes down to values again, doesn't it? I was placed beneath a bare light bulb in a motel room and really given hell for doing what I was doing here, which I knew was the right thing to do. You can get a lot of courage if you know deep down what you're doing is right. And that's where the ethics comes in. In our hands remain these resources. And if we pull those hands apart, we drop it, and no one else picks it up, because we're the only ones that recognize the value of these resources, the other ones that have the knowledge and wherewithal to keep them alive. Can we do it? Goethe put it this way, great German philosopher: every man or woman has only enough strength to complete those assignments of which he or she is fully convinced of their importance. And what this says is, if you believe you can do it, you probably can. But if you don't believe you can, you'll never try, and therefore there's no way that you can win. So I think the future of these desert fishes and all similar creatures, all similar things philosophically here in the nation, lie within things like the University of California, and I'll say at Berkeley, because I think much of this thinking begins here. It sure did with me. Because to promote perception is the only truly creative part of recreational engineering. And that's what universities do, and they do it so well. How do you promote perception? Well, it began with me here 56 years ago at Berkeley. But all I can say is, there's a building here now, I think, where I took that back in 1950. There's only one way to do it. Let there be light. And I think that's what we're all here for this evening. Thank you very much for your attention. It's been a pleasure to be here with you. Doug.
Bill, as of September 10th, 2002, how would you assess the chances of the various pupfish species?
Well, it's not a very bright picture. But we have enough successes to give us reason to believe that you can work these things out. That's why I keep bringing in the ethical perspectives, Doug, because if we can convince the electorate that these things are important, we can do it. But if we don't do that, if we can't promote perception within the American public, it's a difficult thing. What we're doing, obviously, we're going the wrong way on a freeway during rush hour, obviously. And it just becomes a matter under the circumstances until we run into the Greyhound bus coming straight toward us. So I like to think, in my own experience, we've been able to keep things from becoming extinct. But I've often thought it's probably a good thing these little fish don't realize how precarious their existence is. I do. I think any good geographer does. I know you and Don do. So that's be my assessment of that. Yeah.
Not to really denigrate the rearing facility in New Mexico, but what is the Devil's Hole pupfish without Devil's Hole?
Yeah, I think it was Annie Dillard put it this way, a great author, that habitat shapes a species like a bowl shapes water. If you keep it out of that bowl too long, it's going to be a different species. You're right. This is what you might call a last-ditch effort, because if you don't do this, there's no way that you can get that species back. And yeah, sure, there are some genetic and some evolutionary problems that immediately come to your mind. You're right. But it's probably better than nothing at all. And then you also have the basic genetic problems that always evolve from captive populations, too, that you have to run up against. So we have good geneticists working on this. We're doing our best under George.
Bill, I wanted to come to your, I think, most important point of all, which is the very last one. This university inspiring students to go on to explore these issues, to develop them, to become protectors, as it were, of us, protecting us from ourselves.
Yeah.
Now, I'll back up a little bit and talk about when I was at the University of Illinois in the early 60s. The president of the university was David Dog Henry. He gave a lecture to the National Association of University Presidents and Chancellors. And his topic was the university as a corporation. That lecture received much attention. And it filled me with a chill. And over the years I've been involved, I've seen his prediction slowly becoming true. What frightens me is I see the university developing schisms so that in the sciences, only those aspects of science that can pay their way will be retained. We kind of push the humanities off in some place and say, well, that's kind of nice, that gives people a little culture over there. But aspects of biology that don't pay their way will be dropped, so that we're moving more and more to not a university when it comes to the sciences, and now I confine my attention to biology, but to institutes of biotechnology, doing only things that are relevant to making people well or to feeding their faces.
Yeah.
And it frightens me very much.
Well, a good example of that, George, is our failure to fund things like systematists or taxonomists. You know, I talk about all these species. If we didn't have people telling us what they were or are, there'd be no basis at all for a recovery program of any type. You know, Carl Hubbs, before he passed on, was just really infuriated about this. To me, it's significant here at Berkeley, the fact we've got the two life science buildings, one for the molecular biologists to bring in the dough and the other one for the rest of us. You know,
the one for the rest of us is split in two.
Yeah.
It has things like 3 kinds of museums.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the status of systematics in that evolutionary area was temporarily saved by E.O. Wilson's biodiversity.
Yeah, sure it was.
The rest of those departments, and even I thought Espen was going to say this for a while, but Novartis came in and that's pretty
Mm-hmm.
Some of the people want to be more as biology, a combination of engineering, or robotics, neural aspects, and so on. So I think even there, this is chipping away.
Yeah, we've got a real battle there on our hands. You had a question here earlier.
Going back to the caper case,
Yeah.
I thought I heard you say that the pumping was spurious.
It was a spurious agricultural operation. Okay, well what it was, this was a big corporation out of Vicksburg, Mississippi, Capert Industries, and they were mainly manufacturing mobile homes. It's a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. And mobile homes don't do much good unless you got a place to put them. So what they were doing out there was they were trying to acquire public land, federal land, mainly Bureau of Land Management land. Then through just the process of the irrigation, getting the water rights, and then what happened eventually, everybody knew was going to happen. Literally, there's so much salt in that water that the crops wouldn't grow. But then they would say, oh my gosh, the crops won't grow, we're going to bring in our mobile homes. So that was essentially our rationale. And that was what the attorneys brought out in the case, that really this was not, it wasn't a matter of, like George meant, feeding the faces of the world. This was simply a matter of a really crummy deal of the state of Nevada and working with the land developer. We found out later, there's a paper put out, or a series of papers called Water for the Future of Southern Nevada. We found out the reason that the state of Nevada, their state engineer's office, was interested in working with the developer. They viewed that Ash Meadows area and its fossil water as a means of getting several million acre-feet for export to Las Vegas, which is only about 80 miles away. So that was picked up, and the Supreme Court people, the guy who was most interested in that whole thing was William Rehnquist, the current Chief Justice. And you have to admire their minds. Rehnquist can even now give you the genus and species of most of those populations out there in the desert. But at least they made that was a Burger court. Warren Burger himself wrote the decision on it. I'm not sure he was so wild about the pupfish. I saw him interviewed down Stanford one time. He was on one of these morning talk shows, and the host, the talk show, asked him, "Oh, well, Justice Burger, did you ever have to do something because of the law to go against what you felt was really the right thing to do?" He says, "Yeah, those blasted little fish." He says, "The law said we had to protect them. That's part of what we had to do, because that's what the law said." But he said, "I can't see any value in a fish that long." So Chief Justices aren't always good, particularly when they elect presidents. Yeah. Enough of that. Yeah.
If geologics is the solution of our problem, then we have a real problem. Because my experience in the university, and not just this university, but in American universities, is the culture of our universities is basically such that it doesn't want to create light, it wants to create each little piece of the spectrum of light. And the spectrum is disjoint. The spectrum is disjoint. And the problem is, was really, I think, beautifully expressed by a Spanish philosopher about half a century ago, Ortega y Gasset, who said, we need a new kind of specialist in our universities, a guy or a person that knows how to integrate knowledge and not continue to search into the ever smaller piece of knowledge to become an expert in. And my experience in the culture of the American university is that we have to really strenuously address the issue of the integration of knowledge, the synthesis of knowledge, instead of the discovery of knowledge. Not that we replace the discovery of knowledge, but we don't pay nearly enough attention to the integration of knowledge in our curriculum.
The scholarship of application as opposed to discovery. Yeah. No, this is indeed true. And a paper I wrote not too long ago, so we reward professors for learning more and more about less and less and publishing in journals read by increasingly few. And there's a lot of truth to that. But how do we break out of that? Because the system's set up otherwise. It's kind of like having the Queen Mary going at full steam from here to England and having somebody try to stop it by putting an oar in the water. You know, that's the kind of thing we face. It's the establishment, but yet if you don't understand it, you don't try, it's never going to change. There has to be somebody who's going to make that change. Has to be people that, is it ecological education, Dale?
I think your last point is the right one. It isn't like the university is going to evolve to some perfect state. It's an ongoing process. And just like the human relationship to the environment is going to be a continuing battle, I think the same thing within the university is going on. And we just have to keep working on trying to make it more what it should be.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things to me is that most students these days have no sense of history.
Yeah.
And I include people interested in biology, biodiversity, and all those sorts of things. They think everything started in 1980, and anything before that is not worth bothering with.
Yep.
One of the things I would like to see is courses that would immerse scientists,
Mm-hmm.
not humanities people, but scientists, in the origins, where the ideas came from, how they developed, and what the various arguments were.
Yeah.
And I think with a little better sense of history, they might see their own activities in a more realistic light in the ongoing.
Does Berkeley teach anything in the history of science?
Oh, I'm sure.
Got it, you almost have to. I know one of,
Whereas, of course, we send our student in ESPM or integrated biology to learn about some of the things, such as, Wallace, for example.
mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't know where that course is. If somebody does, I'd like to know. However, it seems to me that if we teach our own subjects well, whatever it is that we teach, I think history should be an intrinsic part of it without explicitly calling the history of science. I do not know how you can go and teach engineering or anything you want if you take Young's modulus or something. To say in what context Young's modulus or Poisson's ratio came about. And we know only from, as Kuhn or somebody said, our textbooks are sterile. Our textbooks don't say it is as if anything published before 1980 didn't exist. That's one of the serious problems we have, is that I would view that any subject that we teach, just like every cell carries its own history, that must be an intrinsic part, but somehow we have made our own subjects sterile. Anyway, it's almost 7 o'clock.
I brought this up to a colleague once, and he said, "What we do, it's called Biology 1.
It's almost 7 o'clock, and I just wanted to finish with that comment. It looks like subsequent to 1957, after the Sputnik, we went to this era of specialization to prove ourselves, number one.
Yeah.
And we went into a tremendous specialization mode, which was needed for establishing ourselves in the engineering and the technology that was needed to put man on the moon. But now what seems to be happening is that nature is asserting in a time lag way that the larger forces of nature are showing that you just cannot go and do whatever you want through specialization.
Mm-hmm.
What that seems to be doing to us as faculty is to rediscover what we used to call liberal arts education.
Yeah.
I think that's, and as Dale said, I think we will evolve into it. We may be a little bit slow, but we will catch up. And our
Yeah.
courses will change, our seminars will change, and we will catch up, but it takes a little time. Anyway, thank you very much.
Well, you're welcome.
Yeah.